There's a particular kind of morning I still remember better than almost any other in my life. And it's not because anything dramatic happened in it. Nothing exploded, nobody chased anybody through the fog. It was just an ordinary Tuesday below Blackwell Tailoring, and by the time it ended, I understood something about who my father was and who I was going to become that I never quite managed to unlearn. Victoria belonged to early risers back then, and it still does, I imagine. Long before the market stalls opened or the church bells bothered announcing the hour, the city had already started breathing. Coal fires under the boilers, milk wagons over wet cobblestones, bakers with their hands in dough before the sun so much as thought about coming up. If you were willing to rise before it did, the city showed you a quieter version of itself. I loved that version. I still do. Our workshop was already glowing under a single oil lamp when I came down that morning, still fighting with a stubborn piece of hair that never once in my life agreed to lie flat. My father was at the workbench sharpening his shears against the whetstone, the same slow rhythm he'd performed 10,000 mornings before that one. Scrape, turn, scrape, turn. Not because the shears needed it every single day, because routine, to him, was its own kind of respect. We didn't talk much over breakfast. Bread from Gideon Moore's ovens, a slice of sharp cheese, Mrs. Finch's apple preserves, coffee for him, tea for me. Neither of us ever felt the need to fill silence just to prove we were paying attention to each other. The city would bring enough noise soon enough. It always did. I gathered my tools the way I did every morning, measuring tape in one pocket, chalk in another, needles, waxed thread, a folding ruler. Everything had a place, and I trusted that order completely, right up until I reached for my coat and my father said one quiet word. Forgot something. I went through everything in my head. Thread? No. The ledger? No. My chalk? No. I ran out of guesses before he finally looked up from the workbench and reached beneath the counter, and what he handed me was small enough to fit in one hand. A little leather-bound journal, the kind of brown that only comes from years of being carried, a leather cord wound twice around it to keep the pages shut. "You've forgotten this," he said. I told him I thought that journal was just for measurements. "It was," he said. And then, after a pause, he clearly meant for me to sit inside for a moment. He added, "It isn't any more." I opened it right there. Most of it was blank. The first handful of pages held measurements I already knew by heart. Mrs. Finch, Gideon, Julian Ashcombe, Mrs. Whitmore. Nothing I hadn't seen 100 times. But tucked between two pages was a small square of charcoal gray fabric, and pinned beneath it a note in handwriting I didn't recognize as young. "Good wool remembers its shape. So do good people." "You wrote this?" I said. He nodded once. "When I was about your age." I told him it wasn't really about fabric. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He crossed the room, closed the journal gently under his own hand, and told me measurements become outdated. People don't. I didn't understand yet. He told me I didn't need to. Not yet. Those two words again, the same ones he'd whispered beneath the floorboards the night before, the ones I still hadn't asked him about. I noticed, even then, that my father never used those words carelessly. I just didn't know why they unsettled me the way they did. A single polite knock came at the door, and my father smiled before he'd even looked up. "Gideon," he said. And sure enough, in came Gideon Moore with a cloth-covered basket and the same joke he told us every single Tuesday for 3 years running, that he'd accidentally baked too much bread again. I told him he'd accidentally baked too much every Tuesday for 3 years, and he grinned and told me that somehow we kept accidentally eating it. But his eyes caught on the journal in my hands, and his smile changed into something softer. "Starting one of those, are you?" I asked if he recognized it. "Oh, certainly," he said. "I remember when your father started carrying his. He was about your age, never went anywhere without it." I asked him once what he kept writing in there, and do you know what he told me? He scratched at his beard and recited it like he'd been waiting years for the chance. "The day I trust my memory more than ink is the day I stop paying attention." I looked down at that worn little journal, and it felt heavier in my hands than it had a moment before. Not because of the leather, because of what it apparently already meant to more people than just me. The bell rang again, this time with purpose, and the first real customer of the day walked in. Business had begun, and I had no way of knowing yet that the pages in my coat pocket would someday hold far more than measurements, that someday they'd matter to the whole city. But that morning, I just tucked the journal into my coat and let it rest there like it had always belonged. By the 9th hour, Blackwell Tailoring felt like its own small world. Customers on the oak benches, morning light through the windows, the snip of scissors mixing with the low hum of conversation. To most people walking past, it was just a tailor's shop. To me that day, it felt like the whole city had decided to visit all at once. The first man through the door was Samuel Hargrove, a broad-shouldered railway engineer who tracked in fine black coal dust no matter how carefully he wiped his boots. My father greeted him by name and then congratulated him before Samuel had said a single word about anything. "On what?" Samuel asked, genuinely lost. "Your promotion," my father said. Samuel stared at him like he'd read his mind, and my father just gestured toward the man's coat. New brass buttons, polished, which nobody bothers doing for ordinary work clothes. New leather satchel, too, which meant he'd started carrying paperwork. Samuel laughed and admitted his own wife had said the exact same thing that morning. I asked my father if he'd already known. "No," he said, "I simply paid attention." While Samuel admired fabric, I opened my journal under the counter, and for the first time I wrote something that wasn't a measurement. New brass buttons, new satchel, proud posture, promotion before the announcement. No fabric, no numbers, just a person. And something about writing it down felt exactly right. The next man through the door was Captain Edmund Braves, retired, carrying an old military overcoat that had clearly been mended more than once, but cleaned meticulously all the same. He wanted the collar repaired, and when I suggested it might be time for a new coat altogether, he refused before I'd even finished a sentence. My father never argued with him. He just ran his fingers along the worn wool and asked how long ago he'd received.
19 years, the captain said. "And how long retired?" 12. My father simply said, "I understand," and I remember thinking that I didn't, not yet. But while my father measured the collar, I noticed the captain kept smoothing one sleeve with his left hand, not absent-mindedly, deliberately, again and again, his wedding ring catching the light each time. That sleeve wasn't even worn, so why keep touching it? And then I saw it. 3 tiny stitches near the cuff, sewn in a slightly different thread than the rest of the coat. Not a tailor's work. Someone else's hand. A family member's hand. I leaned toward my father and told him quietly he doesn't want a new coat. "No," my father agreed. "Because someone repaired this one," I said. "Yes." "His wife?" My father looked up properly for the first time and asked what made me think that. "The stitching," I said. "The thread, the way he keeps touching that sleeve. The repair wasn't meant to last. It was meant to be remembered." For just a moment I saw something in my father's eyes I hadn't seen directed at me before. Not loud pride, just quiet satisfaction. "I believe," he said softly, "you're beginning to see." When the captain left that day, he told me something before he went, that my father had once repaired this very coat for him free of charge, and when he'd insisted on paying, my father had only asked him one question. "Would you repair a soldier's medals because the brass had faded?" The captain had said no, of course not. And my father had answered, then why would I replace the memories that coat carries? He told me he'd never forgotten that. Neither have I. Not long after, a young woman came in with her mother, nervous hands, bright eyes, a little sketchbook full of wedding dress designs, admitting she'd never ordered a dress before in her life. My father told her that was fortunate, because she'd only ever need one. For half a second the whole room went quiet, and then she laughed so hard she nearly dropped her sketchbook, and her mother wiped away a tear right along with her. Just like that, all her nervousness disappeared. My father hadn't discussed fabric or price or even measurements yet. He'd simply been kind to her first, and everything else followed naturally after that. I wrote in my journal again that afternoon. People remember how they felt, long after they forget what was actually said. I looked over at my father and thought, maybe that had always been the real craft, not the stitching at all. The crowd thinned out eventually. The shop grew quiet, and I told my father I had forgotten how tired standing all day could make a man. He told me it wasn't the standing. It's the listening, he said. A man who truly listens works twice. And that's when the bell rang for a man I'd never met before. Tall, lean, clean-shaven, a dark overcoat clearly old but carefully kept, one sleeve repaired so well you could barely find the seam. My father's whole expression changed the moment he saw him. Not wider, warmer. Inspector Thorne, he said. No title needed in return, just Alder.
He told me my father spoke well of me, frequently, which surprised me more than it probably should have. He'd come about his left shoulder, worn thin from years of carrying a satchel, and when he offered to just have it replaced, my father told him no, he wouldn't do that, and the inspector said he'd been hoping he'd say exactly that. While my father pinned the shoulder, I found myself quietly studying this man the way I'd been learning to study everyone. His boots were clean, cleaner than most constables I'd seen, but there was a ring of dried mud on the left sole, a different kind of soil, recently traveled. Faint ink stains scattered across his cuffs, not from a desk, from writing while standing. His coat carried the smell of pipe smoke, but his own gloves showed no trace of tobacco at all. And his eyes had that particular redness that comes from several nights of too little sleep, not just one. Before I'd really decided to speak, I heard myself say it out loud. "You've been interviewing someone." The room went completely silent. The inspector looked up slowly and asked me to repeat myself, and my father didn't rescue me and didn't interrupt either. He just waited, the way he always did when he thought I already had the answer inside me. So I kept going. Told him his coat smelled of pipe tobacco, but his gloves didn't, so the smell had come from someone else. Told him the ink stains meant he'd been writing frequently, but standing, not seated. Told him the mud on his boot was riverbank clay, meaning he'd been near the River Ash recently. And I guessed, carefully, that he'd been speaking to dock workers, probably across more than one day. The clock ticked twice in that silence before the inspector finally smiled, a real one. "Remarkable," he said, and turned to my father. "You've taught him well." My father shook his head. "No, I taught him to look. He taught him to see." The inspector laughed and told me I'd been mostly correct. 4 days speaking with dock workers, one of whom smoked a pipe. The riverbank, correct. The writing, correct. The only mistake, he said, was assuming there'd only been one person involved at all. I told him I understood. "No," he said gently, "you will." And somehow that didn't feel like criticism at all. It felt like something closer to a promise. The two of them talked for a while after that, not about crime, just about people. Most witnesses, the inspector said, actually tell the truth. I admitted I'd always assumed most people lied. They do, he agreed, but usually only about what they think matters, and reveal everything else without meaning to. My father added quietly, and reveal everything else. And for one strange moment, the tailor and the investigator looked almost identical to me, not in appearance, in the shape of how they thought. Two men who'd arrived at the exact same understanding of people by walking two completely different roads to get there. Before he left, the inspector told me something my father had once told him. Never begin an investigation by looking for guilt. Begin by looking for truth. He said it had made him a far better investigator. My father said nothing at all. He just nodded once, the kind of nod that passes between two people who deeply respect each other's craft without ever needing to say so out loud. After he'd disappeared into the afternoon crowd, I stood by the window and asked my father how many people actually knew him, not customers, knew him. He told me he'd never counted. I told him it felt like everyone who walked through our door left carrying more than just a coat.
He was quiet for a long moment, and then said, perhaps, or perhaps they simply leave feeling seen. I didn't write that one down right away. Some lessons I was starting to learn deserved to sit in memory for a while before they earned a place on paper. The afternoon slowed down after that. Sunlight stretching long and gold across the floorboards, dust drifting lazily in the light. I made coffee, and when I brought it back to the cutting table, I found my father standing in front of the shelves at the back of the shop, not looking for fabric, looking at something else entirely. An old, thick leather ledger, its spine cracked with age, pages loose at the edges. "You've been looking at that more lately," I said. "I have," he admitted. "What is it?" "My first ledger." I told him I thought his first ledger had been smaller. "It was," he said, and handed me this older, heavier one instead. My first journal. The early pages looked exactly like I expected. Measurements, names, fabric costs, dates, all in neat, careful handwriting. But a few pages in, something changed. Between the ordinary notes were observations, not so different from the one I'd written just that morning. A man who preferred worn collars and never removed his wedding ring while being measured. A woman who arrived exactly 5 minutes early every time and spoke kindly to everyone except herself. A retired captain who carried grief in his shoulders but stood straighter the moment he mentioned his daughter. "These aren't tailoring notes," I said slowly. "No," my father agreed. "They're people," I said. "Exactly," he told me. One entry, further in, had no name attached to it at all, just "Young apprentice, hands shake only when praised." "There isn't a name," I said. "There wasn't one," he told me. "You remembered anyway." "I remembered enough," was all he said, and something in the way he said it made me wonder even then whether that particular entry might have been about someone closer to him than a stranger. I asked him why he'd started keeping these at all, and he answered with a question of his own. "If I asked you how tall Mrs. Finch is, what would you say?" 5'3", I guessed. "And her eye color?" "Brown." "And why she always keeps one bouquet hidden beneath her counter that she never sells?" I stopped. I already knew that one. It was her husband's favorite. "Which answer," he asked, "tells you who she actually is?" "The last one," I said quietly. He rested his hand on that old ledger and told me measurements help me make clothes. Understanding helps me serve people. Not long after that, the bell rang again, and a stonemason walked in carrying a small wooden crate, dust on his clothes, an uneven beard, hands cut fine from years of working stone. He looked deeply uncomfortable, almost embarrassed, and admitted right away that he didn't actually need a suit. He needed advice. My father simply pulled out a chair and told him to sit. His name was Owen Mercer, and when my father asked if he was any relation to Dorian Mercer, Owen blinked in surprise and said Dorian was his uncle, and that his uncle had told him my father would probably already know.
His daughter, he told us, had been accepted into the Royal Academy. He'd been saving for years, could afford the tuition itself without any trouble, but not everything else that came with walking through those doors. He didn't want her arriving looking like she didn't belong somewhere she'd fully earned the right to be. My father stood without a word and walked to one of the locked storage cabinets.
Inside, protected under white cloth, hung several finished garments, and he chose one. A beautiful navy student coat, simple, elegant, timeless. He laid it across the table and told Owen, "My grandfather made this. It had never been worn. He'd been waiting," he said, "for someone who needed it more than he did." Owen stood there completely speechless. My father told him he could take it, but he hadn't asked for a single coin in return, and that Owen had already thanked him plenty, simply by raising a daughter who'd earned her own place in the world. I watched every second of that exchange, and I understood, maybe for the first time completely, that my father wasn't giving away a coat that afternoon. He was giving away an opportunity. And I realized that kindness, like skill with a needle, could apparently be inherited too, if you were lucky enough to grow up watching it closely enough. After Owen left, I asked my father if he'd really kept that coat all those years without knowing who'd eventually wear it. He admitted he hadn't, but I was hopeful, he said, and somehow that answer taught me even more than certainty ever could have. Later, once the shop had gone quiet again, I pushed a little further, asked if he'd ever thought about selling that coat instead. "Many times," he admitted. I reminded him he'd said he was waiting. "I was," he said. "Waiting doesn't mean the temptation ever disappears." I thought about the roof we'd patched 3 winters earlier, the evenings we'd stretched a little bread and soup further than it probably should have gone. All the time selling that coat would have made things considerably easier on both of us. "You could have used the money," I said. "Yes," he agreed. "And no one would have blamed you." "No," he agreed again. "Then why keep it?" He told me that when his own father had finished that coat, he'd told him something he'd never forgotten. Never let urgency rob someone else of hope. Every time he thought seriously about selling it, he said, he imagined the person who might someday actually need it. And today, he said quietly, they finally walked through our door. I told him I didn't think I could have done what he'd just done. He laughed softly and told me he knew that, and that I wasn't supposed to be able to yet. When he was 17, he admitted, he wouldn't have done it either. I told him I'd always assumed he'd simply always been like this, patient and generous and wise, all the way through. No man wakes up wise, he told me. We become who we are, one decision at a time. The rest of that afternoon passed peacefully. Small alterations, quick repairs, nothing especially remarkable on the surface. But I found myself watching my father differently now, not studying the tailoring anymore, studying the man underneath it. Why he remembered absolutely everyone, why he refused unnecessary profit whenever he could, why every single customer walked out smiling. It wasn't because he wanted to be admired for any of it. If anything, he seemed almost uncomfortable accepting praise directly. He simply seemed happiest whenever someone else walked out lighter than they'd walked in. Near sunset, Mrs. Finch came by with a small basket, 3 jars of her sister's blackberry preserves tied up in linen. "Gideon accidentally bakes too much," I joked, "and now your sister accidentally preserves too much."
She smiled and said, "It must be contagious." We shared an easy laugh, and then her voice softened. She already heard about Owen. Of course she had. "This is the Gray District," she reminded me. "News travels faster than the wind here." She told us his little girl had cried the entire way home. My father looked genuinely concerned until she added, quickly, that they'd been happy tears. That the girl had said, for the first time in weeks, her father had smiled without pretending to.
Mrs. Finch squeezed my father's hand gently before she left and told him he'd been stitching this neighborhood together for far longer than he probably realized. The evening sun turned the whole workshop amber, dust drifting slowly through the light, and I finally said out loud what I'd been putting together all day. "I think I understand now. People keep thanking you for the clothes," I told him, "but they're never really talking about the clothes at all. They're talking about how you made them feel." My father smiled and told me he'd been wondering when I'd finally notice. I reached into my coat, pulled out that little leather journal one more time, untied the cord, and opened it to a fresh page. This time I didn't write about measurements. I didn't write about fabric at all. I wrote one single sentence, and I still remember exactly how it felt to write it. "The finest thing a tailor can mend isn't cloth. It's a person's belief in themselves." I stared at those words for a long time before I finally closed the journal. Outside, the last light slipped behind the rooftops of Victoria, and inside our little shop, the lamps came on one by one, warm and golden across the wood and the folded fabric and the quiet faces of a father and his son who'd just spent one more ordinary day changing lives in ways neither of us would ever think to boast about. I didn't know it yet, not fully, but that was the day I stopped simply watching my father's world and started actually carrying a piece of it myself. Somewhere out beyond those windows, the city kept moving the way it always did, without the faintest idea that one of its quietest, truest legacies was still being stitched together, one small lesson, one small kindness, one small page at a time. And if you ask me now, all these years later, what the Blackwell name actually weighs, I won't tell you it's heavy. I'll tell you it's simply full. Full of every person who ever walked through that door and left a little more certain of who they were than when they'd come in. That's the inheritance my father actually left me. Not a shop, not a name stitched onto a sign above a door. A way of paying attention to people closely enough and kindly enough that they leave feeling seen. I've carried that with me every day since.